How many of you remember the science lab? Was that a great experience? You know, you were playing with things, you were testing things, you were experimenting. And I went to an all-boys school, so we probably had a little bit more fun. In other words, we pushed the boundaries a little bit more. And I have great sympathy for my physics teacher and for my chemistry teacher, because the experiments that we were supposed to do, we did, but we were also trying to sometimes see if they could work or where the limits of those experiments were. I don't know what you've experimented with. Maybe it's something that you've been doing even with cooking, trying to check whether the flavours all go together, trying to see whatever could happen. But I want to talk about an experiment right now of somebody who thought they'd teach probability. Now, you understand probability. If you've got a coin and you flick the coin, it will either come down head side up or tail side up. All right? Simple as that. And if you flick it often enough, in theory, it should come down the same number of times heads up as it does tails up, right? In theory. And of course, teaching probability is quite a challenge, trying to work out how you're going to put this together and how you're going to get the students' attention. And this particular teacher, whose name was Murphy, so with a name like Murphy, it's obviously Irish. And if it's Irish, you know that there's going to be something that goes wrong somewhere. All right? Let's be kind to them. So he decided the best way to teach probability was to get a great big tray, and he was going to have slices of bread on that tray. And to make the difference between one side of the bread and the other side of the bread, they decided that they were going to spread peanut butter on that bread. Now, I feel very sorry for those who have allergies for peanuts. I really do feel sorry. Because I think there's a text in Scripture that says, man does not live by bread alone. He needs peanut butter also. I like my nuts. So here you had this tray. Obviously, the underside was plain bread. The top side was peanut butter. And after the students had spread all the peanut butter on the bread, it was ready for the experiment. So he found 4 of the strongest guys in that particular class and got them on each of the corners of this tray of peanut butter covered bread. Okay, so what did they do then? They were asked to flick that tray in the air, and the expectation was that you would get half the slices of bread coming up bread and half the slices of bread coming up peanut butter. Simple as that. So they flicked it into the air, and guess what happened? Too many pieces stuck to the roof. And this comes back to the idea of Murphy's Law. If anything can go wrong, it will. But I like the idea that Keith Nock comes along and says, but there's always a lesson in it somewhere. And if you stop and think about it, you know, the peanut butter is going to weigh it down a little, so you're probably not going to get exactly the same ability to turn it and flip it. And of course, if anything sticks to the roof, you know, it's not the peanut butter I like. I like the crunchy one that'll come away. I want you to think about experiments. Life is one big experiment, isn't it? You only live it once. You make different decisions each day. But I want to come back and think about what sort of experiments we can do with life. I want to turn to Solomon, and I want to think about Solomon's experiments. The wisest man. And it's very clear that he had great wisdom and he applied great wisdom in many different activities and different stories. But I want to think about the experiments he was involved in. He was always trying something new, something different, something challenging, maybe something trendy. He was overturning every stone he could in search for meaning. But if anything could go wrong, it did. This morning I want to think through these 10 experiments that we can find that Solomon undertook. Nothing was quite as drastic as peanut butter on bread. Okay? Obviously not designed for a probability experiment, just designed for eating. Let's take the next slide if we can. The 10 experiments with his life, and if we can move on to the next one. The first experiment was education, and we're looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, please, I believe education is very important. I look for every opportunity I can to educate myself. But I've also been in theological education for more than 30 years. It's a bit scary when you think about it like that, isn't it? Time's moving on. So I'm not in any way wanting to depreciate education. Education is something I really value. The more I learn, the more I understand I don't know. You know what I mean? And his first experiment was in knowledge and wisdom. If only I could know more and be wiser, I'd have a happier life. I'd have a life full of meaning and purpose. Well, the more you know, the more you realise you don't know. And the more knowledge you have, sometimes the more suffering there is. I have a daughter who was involved in the healthcare system, in the medical field. And she was talking to me once about the fact that the greatest tensions and challenges we've got, the greatest ethical challenges we've got, have come because of advanced technology. Do you do this or don't you do this? Is this morally right or morally wrong? And the more we know and the more we can develop, the more we get into some of these pickles, the more we get into some of these challenges. Education, knowledge and wisdom was his first failed experiment. Not because he didn't learn, not because he wasn't wise, but because it didn't give him the meaning and purpose for life. He went on to his second experiment, and this was an experiment of pleasure. Okay? The search for pleasure. And I want you to think about that. The so-called good life. If I've got pleasure, I've got happiness. Let's go and find whatever pleasure will do, whatever pleasure will give us. Maybe it's wine, houses, land, employees, wealth, music, women. Those are the things that Solomon chased. Interestingly, they're the things people still chase today, aren't they? But Solomon discovers that pleasure is still emptiness. We're trying to forget that yesterday's fun has finished. You know what I mean? We're trying to find meaning and purpose in just having a great time. Now listen, I like having a good time, but it's not going to give me meaning and purpose for life. So we went on to experiment number 3. And that experiment was about work. Now, I value work. Maybe I value it too much. You know, you've heard about workaholics? Please, do what I say, not do what I do. You understand what I'm saying there? And you can be so involved in work, your whole identity can be wrapped up in who you are in work. And when work's not there, what happens to you? Do you understand what I'm saying? But the more you work, yes, you may make something, you may achieve something, there may be some satisfaction, but sometimes it's just going through the motions, isn't it? It's just becoming routine, maybe even meaningless. And then you start to say, do I have to get up and go to work? Well, maybe I'm getting around the time and age where I need to start thinking about doing something else. But the point I want to make is work going to give you that meaning and purpose to life? I don't think so. And you see so many people who've worked so hard, doing so much, but at the end of the day, have they found that happiness? Right? There's something about the dignity of work. It's important. There's something about the achievement of work. It's important. But work on its own will never satisfy. So having moved from the experiential stage of trying to find meaning in education, in pleasure and in work, he steps back, and his next experiment is starting to think a little bit more philosophically. Maybe I could find more meaning if I could actually think through something else. Maybe I could think about fatalism, naturalism, rationalism. Maybe I'm trying to find meaning through discovering the rational base. Why does this happen? Why does that happen? If only I could get to the bottom of this, it would make it so much easier for me to find meaning and purpose, because I would understand so much more. It's not just about education. It's about trying to find the rationale. It's a word we often use, education. Don't just tell me what you know. Don't just tell me what you're going to do. Tell me why you're going to do it. So important. But yet again, you can understand some of that natural, unchanging order. But does that necessarily bring meaning and purpose? It brings knowledge. It brings understanding. But does that alone bring meaning and purpose? So Solomon went on to his fifth experiment. And this time the experiment was looking for natural justice, looking for human rights. If only we could get things sorted and we respected everybody and we respected boundaries and we're there looking for justice and ensuring that everybody experienced justice, surely we'd find some happiness, some meaning, some purpose. But all Solomon ever saw was injustice. And I don't care what your political system may be. I don't care what your view of life may be. There will never be justice this side of the kingdom. We want to do everything we can to be as just and responsible as we can. But no matter how well thought out our systems of justice and rights, there's still a boundary between my rights and your rights. There's still going to be some injustice somewhere because we're not living in a perfect world, even if it's unintentional. There is still injustice. So we went on to another experiment. And experiment number 6 was, if I can't do this through naturalism and fatalism and rationalism, if I can't do this through justice, maybe what I need more than anything else is the power to control. You know? It's fascinating watching what's going on in the world at the moment. All these different power plays. And I'm happy to support you, because if I let you do that, I can do this. Power. Popularity. Politics. You know, Solomon discovered very quickly that if you had the power and if you had the popularity, it would be brief, uncertain, and soon forgotten. How many prime ministers have we had in the last decade here? Yes, all right. I'm not asking for you to name them. I'm not asking for any other commentary. I'm just simply making the point, it's brief, uncertain, and soon forgotten. Even if they've done something really, really important, there's been something really significant, something really memorable, something really transformative, it is still brief, uncertain, and soon forgotten. You just move back into history. Well, if that doesn't work, what's our next experiment? You'll be interested to know that Solomon is looking at religious behaviour. If only I could act right, as long as I could behave right, as long as my external experience and my external outlook was right, maybe I'd find meaning and purpose. But going through the motions is meaningless. Coming here is meaningless on its own. Solomon still did not find the meaning and purpose, because all it was outward forms, a mask, a ritual. And if it's only a mask and a ritual, it's not the real you. You understand what I'm saying? So he went on to another experiment. Experiment number 8. Well, if it doesn't work to have naturalism, rationalism, and fatalism, if it doesn't work to have the idea of natural justice and human rights, if it doesn't work to have popularity and power in politics, if it doesn't work to have religious behaviour, let's try wealth. Because if I've got all the money, I've really got the ability to be able to do what I want to do and do when I want to do it, and I can do it just so easily. But it's fascinating to know that the more you have, the less you're satisfied. It's mind-blowing to think that there are people that are more valuable than some countries. Mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing to think that they can control more than just politics. And does it satisfy? I come back to thinking about John Rockefeller. Probably one of the wealthiest people of his time. And he was so focused on getting wealth and wealth and more wealth and more wealth and more wealth that his own health was starting to suffer. At the age of 53, he was facing an uncertain future. And at the age of 53, he suddenly realised that money did not buy happiness. It didn't matter how much money. And it would be interesting to actually try and convert the value Rockefeller had at that point in today's currency. And it was only then that he established the Rockefeller Foundation that we know about today. It was only then when he started to give away his money that his health returned. It was only then that he found that there was more to life than just accumulating wealth. And Solomon discovered. And let's remember, he was king in the golden age of Israel. He was wealthy. That the more you have, the less you're satisfied. We see it today, don't we? How many of those who are the heroes, the actors, the actresses, the sports stars, the musicians, are ending their life early because there's no satisfaction. There is no meaning. There is no purpose in what they're doing. So Solomon goes on and changes gears again. Rather than just experience, rather than just philosophy, he chooses to end up being very pragmatic. And the last two experiments are experiments in pragmatism. Material things. Let's chase material things. The more possessions I can get, obviously that's going to get me happier. It's almost as if this was consumerism 101, 1000 BC. Well, 930 is when he died. Riches, honour, wealth cannot be enjoyed unless God permits. Everything I do will never satisfy my soul. No matter what I accumulate, no matter how great and grand that is, no matter how important and impressive that is, the more I get, the more I've got to store, the more I've got to worry about, the more I've got to think about, and the less satisfaction I have. It always intrigues me to see how happy some people can be with nothing. Do you understand what I mean? It was fascinating watching our two daughters grow up in places like Fiji and Papua New Guinea. They had a few things. They had more than some of the others. But they were overwhelmed when they'd come back and visit family and see what other family members might have. They could make their own fun with nothing. You know what I mean? Nothing. It's amazing how creative we can be if there is nothing. True? And how much happier are we the less that we have to worry about? You understand what I'm saying? I've heard of some countries described as there are a third of the population working in the security force to protect the third that have from the third that don't have. If only it was just a statement. Nothing in terms of possessions will satisfy. And the last experiment, well, again, pragmatism. If something goes wrong, you want to put a policy or a process in place to make sure it doesn't go wrong again. You know what I mean? It's one of the things you always do in administration. If something goes wrong, what can we learn from it? How can we make sure it doesn't go wrong again? But it will. Something else will pop up. Something else you haven't anticipated. Something else will happen and you're going to have to step in and manage it. Policies and processes, good as they are, still do not bring happiness. Do not bring meaning and purpose. Even if we can get the right policies, the right processes, get everyone following them, and that's a challenge, it's still not bringing happiness. It's still not bringing meaning. It's still not bringing purpose. So let's summarize these 10 experiments. The 3 in education, the 5 in philosophy, the 2 in pragmatism. Solomon has tried everything he can to find meaning and purpose, and he still ends up sad, searching for something more, searching for something greater. I want to come to chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes. Because after all of these life searches that he's gone through, he comes to the conclusion of the matter. This is a verse I'm sure many of you will know. Remember now the Creator in the days of thy youth, before the evil days come, and there is no pleasure in them. Interesting, isn't it? Young, invincible, nothing can go wrong, can it? Hey? I can risk whatever I like. I can climb to the top of the mountains. I can go into the clouds. I can do all of these things. Nothing will tear me apart. Nothing is impossible. There's something about youthful exuberance, youthful opportunities, the way in which we'll explore, we'll keep on creating, we'll keep on trying, we'll keep on testing those boundaries. Invincible. But Solomon's conclusion was, if you really want meaning and purpose, it's remembering now the Creator. Now, let's talk about youth for a minute. What is the age of youth? I'm starting to get to the stage that it's anything under 100. My mother used to have a phrase when anyone would ask her how old she was, "Oh, I'm going on 90. It's true for all of us, really. Ironically, she died at 90, but almost 91. That's another story for another day. It's interesting. I wish I had time this morning, and I'm not going to take the time, but I want you to think about the verses that follow Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1, because they start to give you some very interesting metaphors, images of old age. Okay? And I want you to think about it. Let's not take the time, because that's a digression from the point I want to make. But if you want to think of some poetic, creative images of describing old age, that's one thing. Let me summarise it very quickly. It's when actions creak louder than words. But I want to come back to this right now. Remember now the Creator. Remember that you and I are a creature. Well, not something by chance. There is a master designer. That Creator is not just someone who's created us, but it's a Creator that has an ongoing interest in us. You know, you buy a car, they're offering you extended warranties these days. They're trying to say, we're interested in your car for this period of time. The Creator of you and I is interested in us for the whole of our life, not just for a year or two. And it's interesting to notice right at the end, in those final verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 12, we end up with this comment. The whole duty of man is to fear God, keep his commandments, because everything comes into judgment. Does that ring a bell? Does that remind you of another passage of Scripture? Does that give you something else to think about? I'd like to suggest it sounds very contemporary to some of the things that we want to talk about. We understand Revelation 14, 6 and 7 is a very important statement for us here and now today. And what's it saying? The everlasting gospel. The everlasting gospel to every kindred, tongue, nation and people. And what is it? Fear God. Give him glory because of the judgment. Not because we've got to be afraid of a judgment, but because we know that the judgment is on our side. And worship the Creator. For me, Ecclesiastes is one of these books written so far ahead of its time. It's so much about what's going on around us and maybe going on in us, about searching for meaning and purpose. Yet to only discover it comes back to remembering the Creator. Remembering the Creator. I want to just stop and think for a moment. How many of you like exams? Can I see a show of hands? I'm disappointed. I'm very, very disappointed. I didn't say how many of you like going into exams. I said how many of you like exams? Let me illustrate. My wife taught our daughters the piano. And sometimes that's a bit of a challenge, mother being the teacher of the pianists, okay? You know when they should be practicing and when they're not. You know, if the teacher's here and they go home, the teacher doesn't have that same, real-time understanding of the practice. And this was the night before her exam. And how do you teach children that you just can't sit down and play the piano like that? You need to practice. You understand what I mean? Well, this practice, everything was off the rails. The scales were not even. They didn't have that crescendo, decrescendo. They didn't have the pace. A disaster. Listen to the pieces. The pieces were no better. And mum and dad look at each other and say, maybe tomorrow is the day that our daughter is going to learn that you can't just pass a music exam without practice. Well, off we went to the exam. It was in a little school, some distance away. There was one layer of bricks between the exam room and where we were sitting waiting. And we could hear absolutely everything going on in the exam room. We could hear the examiner say, will you play this scale? And my wife has perfect pitch, something I can't claim. And she could hear that the scale went just the way it should. Right pace, right crescendo, decrescendo. Everything was as smooth as you could. And we looked at each other and said, how long can this last? The second scale, the third scale, the fourth scale. And my wife said, well, she actually played B major, not B flat major. Okay. Then the pieces, and the pieces went really well. And we're looking at each other saying, what happened? What went on during the night? This is so different from last night. And then she came on to the orals. And, they were quite good. My wife picked something up about the orals as well. And it was in the days where the students would walk out with their results straight after the exam. And the door opens and she comes out, not realising the examiner's coming behind her to find out who her teacher is that's done such a fantastic job. And our daughter comes out saying, I got an A. Right? I got an A. She didn't say it loud enough for the examiner to hear, so she didn't embarrass herself. On the other side of an exam, don't you like the results, especially when they're good? So you do like exams. You get the point I'm making? What's there to fear about the judgment when Jesus has paid our price? That's the sort of creator we have. A creator that has a money-back guarantee. That if you follow in my steps, you will find happiness. If you live my values, you will find happiness. If you come and serve me, you will find happiness. My prayer for you this morning is that you will find that happiness, because we can give God glory for the judgment. We can worship him as our creator. I just want to pick up, to conclude, some words of one of my favourite songwriters. I know it dates me. He is older than me. Graham Kendrick. All I once held dear, built my life upon. All this world reveres and wars to own. All I once thought gain, I have counted loss, spent and worthless now compared to this. Knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. Now my heart's desire is to know you more, to be found in you and known as yours, to possess by faith what I could not earn, all surpassing gift of righteousness. Knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. Oh, to know the power of your risen life, to know you in your sufferings, to become like you in your death, my Lord, so with you to live and never die. Knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. My prayer for you this morning is, remember now our Creator. Repent of our own foolish experiments. Reaffirm our connection with Jesus today, and reassert ourselves in this community as his ambassadors.